Shalom, 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 Israel. This is Captain Paul Israel from Kingdom Builders of Israel LLC, and today's class lesson is going to be on it is lawful to do well on the Sabbath day while in captivity, part 2. Again, Israel, this is going to be the part 2 lesson of it's lawful to do well on the Sabbath days while in captivity. Okay, this is the part 2 lesson of the understanding, because we have many Hebrew Israelites that's in these camps that don't understand the captivity constraints that we have in these last days that's preventing us as Hebrew Israelites on keeping Yahweh's Sabbath day holy the right way. Okay, so this is why I'm doing this lesson, Israel, to show that the understanding of us keeping the Sabbath day while in captivity have to be basically explained. Okay, so this part 2 lesson is going to go into Yahshua the Mashiach, the Black Messiah, understanding on the Sabbath day understanding when it pertains to work or a certain type of form of work to be done on the Sabbath day while in captivity understanding. So we're going to break down this understanding based upon Yahshua the Mashiach explaining to the Pharisees understanding of the mercy and grace analogy, okay, from this perspective on certain things that the disciples was doing on this particular Sabbath day that's being explained in this understanding in the New Testament. Okay, so this is going to be a deep lesson, Israel, so get out your pen and notepad, because I'm going to break down the understanding for you so you can understand, because we do have Hebrew Israelites that are telling people that Christ, the Black Messiah, broke the Sabbath day, when that is not true. Okay, Yahweh didn't send Yahshua down here to break the Sabbath day. Yahweh sent Yahshua the Mashiach down to earth to be that light to Israel, to show us how to operate in the right spirit while we are basically in captivity constraints. Okay, so this is that understanding. Okay, so we're going to go to the book of Matthew chapter 12 verse 1 to get the understanding of the certain analogy of this particular Sabbath day understanding when the disciples was found to be doing a certain form of work on the Sabbath. Okay, and Yahshua the Mashiach is going to explain to the Pharisees that the disciples were not in violation of the Sabbath day based upon certain circumstances. Okay, so we're going to bring this out in this lesson. Okay, Israel, so we start now in the book of Matthew chapter 12 verse 1. Okay, it says, at that time Yahshua went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were an hunger, and began to pluck the ears of corn and to eat. So again, of course, in general, the Sabbath day entails no form of work to be done on the Sabbath day. But in this instance, the disciples took it upon themselves to do what? Go to the field of corn to pluck the ears of corn. Notice Yahshua the Mashiach was not plucking the ears of corn to eat the corn. Okay, but the disciples were doing it as far as going into the field to pluck the ears of the corn because they got hungry. And also you have to understand that the disciples was going to missionary journeys with Christ, the Black Messiah. So they most likely had forgot to properly prepare or prep for the Sabbath day, so they wouldn't have to go to the field to pluck ears off the corn. Okay, so this is what, of course, the disciples were doing. Okay, but notice Yahshua the Mashiach is not plucking the ears of the corn on the Sabbath day. This is going into the disciples were doing that. Okay, but again, it was a reason why, of course, the disciples were plucking the ears of the corn in the field on the Sabbath day, because they got hungry. They made a mistake as far as not properly preparing a certain meal to be done or to be eaten for the particular Sabbath day. Okay, so this was a mistake with the disciples when they was doing it. But you gotta look at the understanding that the disciples were on missionary journeys with Christ. So you don't know how their work schedule was as far as pertaining to their missionary journeys. Okay, so it was just a common mistake, because at the end of the day, we as the children of Israel are not perfect, right? We fall short at times. Okay, so but Christ is going to give the Pharisee the understanding of the mercy and grace analogy with the understanding, because at the end of the day, what was the condition of the Israelites at this time? the Israelites were in captivity under the Roman Empire. Okay, because you had the Roman Empire that had set up Herod and Herod's descendants to be the force to put the Israelites in subjection. Okay, Herod and Herod's descendants were not Hebrew Israelites, but they had dominant reign in Israel, where the children of Israel sojourned at. Okay, so at this time, the Hebrew Israelites were in bondage and slavery under the Roman Empire. But the difference analogy is the Roman Empire allowed the children of Israel to practice the Hebrew custom to a certain degree. But again, the Hebrew custom was not all the way together because you had wicked leadership that was being referred to as those Pharisees, scribes, and Sadducees. Okay, in general, yes, you had certain righteous men in the mix of that group, but those men were not righteous men overall. Okay, but it was certain individuals that was aspiring to do the right thing. Okay, but at the end of the day, you have to know the history of the timeline. Okay, the Hebrew Israelites was not in 100% understanding with the right leadership at this time. Okay, so this is what the disciples was doing. They was plucking ears of the corn in the field on the Sabbath day because they got hungry. Okay, because they made a mistake to not properly prepare to eat a certain type of meal or food on the Sabbath day, because again, there's no cooking or buying and selling on the Sabbath day. Okay, so they did a form of work on the Sabbath day by plucking the ears of the corn, okay, to eat because they got hungry. Okay, so that's what it's saying. Okay, so Matthew chapter 12 verse 2. Now we're going to get the understanding that those Pharisees are now going to call out the disciples as saying that they was in error by plucking the ears of the corn on the Sabbath day. This is what the Pharisees is going to be coming with, that understanding. But Yahshua the Mashiach is going to correct the Pharisees with their chastisement on those disciples. Okay, because Yahshua the Mashiach is going to stand up for his brethren. Okay, who was those disciples who followed after him. Okay. This is going to be the understanding in the book of Matthew chapter 12 verse 2. It says, "But when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, Behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day." You see that, Israel? So you see what the Pharisees did? They saw the disciples plucking ears of the corn on the Sabbath day in the field, and they was like, hey, those disciples don't do what is lawful on the Sabbath day. Okay, because you're not supposed to be plucking ears on the corn on the Sabbath day. Okay, because that's a form of work. So let's see what Christ the Black Messiah is going to say. Because again, Christ is coming with that mercy and grace understanding to understand the situation. Okay, because those disciples had got hungry. It was an emergency situation. So those disciples was not willingly just going out there to the field plucking ears of the corn, right? They did it based upon an emergency situation. And also the Hebrew Israelites was in captivity under the Roman Empire. Okay, so there again, that's the understanding that these Pharisees is not putting into consideration. Okay, the Pharisees wanted the understanding to be 100%. Everybody got to go by these rules and laws to the 100% T, but end of the day, certain circumstances have to come about in certain cases, which is going to be permissible to do on the Sabbath day based upon emergency. And also, again, the Israelites was in captivity under the Roman Empire. Okay, so this is what the Pharisees are not comprehending. Okay, and also these Pharisees are somewhat of your modern day Hebrew Israelites of today, that we have Hebrew Israelites trying to persecute Hebrew Israelites that are working on the Sabbath. So this is what type of spirit these modern day Hebrew Israelites have, just like these Pharisees spirits have, when they're basically trying to chastise the men and women that are in captivity constraints and they have to work on the Sabbath. This is what the Pharisees was doing when they was trying to justify their own righteousness by them observing those disciples plucking ears of the corn on the Sabbath day. Okay, so again, Yahshua the Mashiach is going to put these Pharisees in place and say that you are in error by judging these disciples that basically was found plucking ears of the corn on the Sabbath day. So Yahshua the Mashiach is going to put the Pharisees in check to show them that they are going off the understanding. Okay, so Matthew chapter 12 verse 3, it says, this is of course Yahshua the Mashiach speaking, okay, in this understanding as far as a rebuttal against those Pharisees that was trying to chastise or try to judge those disciples. Okay, Matthew chapter 12 verse 3, but he said unto them, have ye not read what David did when he was an hungered, and they that were with him? So again, Christ the Black Messiah is breaking out history of David. Before he became king, David had went to that tabernacle and he ended up eating the showbread that was only supposed to be eaten by the Levitical priesthood, right? But David was not a Levite. And only the Levites were commissioned to only eat that showbread that was in that tabernacle. But David ended up eating the showbread based upon him being a hunger, or basically being hungry. But initially, David didn't initially want to go to the tabernacle to eat the showbread. He asked one of the Levite priests to, hey, just give me some bread to eat, because, you know, he was hungry. And David, of course, in general, was on the run from King Saul, because King Saul wanted to kill David. Okay, so based upon King Saul wanted to kill David, David had to be on the run. So he needed some food to eat when he was on his certain journeys to escape him being killed by King Saul. So basically, David had asked this priest to give him some bread, but the priest told David, hey, we only have showbread here. So again, David ended up getting the showbread instead, but that wasn't his initial thing to eat. Okay, but again, it was an emergency situation because David was on the run as far as fleeing from King Saul persecution. Okay, so again, this was an emergency situation. So this is what Yahshua the Mashiach is explaining to those Pharisees, that in emergency circumstances, this is what is permissible to do in certain cases. Okay, because Yahweh is merciful unto those individuals that are hearkening to his words. But certain instances may occur where you may fall short in certain matters. Okay, but Yahweh has mercy on the Hebrew Israelites in certain cases. Okay, so this is what Yahshua is explaining to those Pharisees, which he's going to break down the understanding, which I already explained earlier, about the priesthood understanding when David needed to eat some showbread, okay, based upon being hungry. Okay, Matthew chapter 12 verse 4, it says, how he entered, of course in general, this is Yahshua the Mashiach still explaining history to those Pharisees, explaining about David. Okay, it says, how he entered into the house of Elohim and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests. You see this? You see this, Israel? So again, Yahshua the Mashiach is explaining to those Pharisees, David even went inside the tabernacle when it was not permitted for him to enter into the tabernacle, because you had to be a Levite to enter the tabernacle. Okay? And did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, because it was not lawful for David to eat the showbread that was on that table in the tabernacle, because the only people that were supposed to eat that bread that was in that tabernacle, which is going to that showbread, were only the Levites. Okay? It says, neither for them which were with him. Okay? Because those men that David had rolled with, as far as having a form of protection with when he was fleeing from King Saul, they also ate the showbread as well. It said, but only for the priests, because only the Levitical priesthood was only commanded to eat the showbread that was in that tabernacle. It was only based upon emergency circumstances, because David and his men got hungry because they was on the run trying to escape the persecution from King Saul. So it was an emergency situation. Okay, so that's what Christ is explaining, that history, that David only did that based upon an emergency circumstance. Okay. So certain cases when formal work is basically going to be done on a Sabbath, is supposed to be based upon emergency circumstances. Just like you fast forward up today with the Hebrew Israelites, when they're working on a Sabbath, it's a form of emergency circumstances so they can be able to survive. Okay? That's the point. Okay, that's the point of this lesson. Because we have Hebrew Israelites that's trying to throw stones at people because they're working on a Sabbath. They're working on a Sabbath because why? It's an emergency situation, so they can better take care of their bills, feed their family. Okay? This is the understanding that Christ is explaining to those wicked Pharisees. Okay? Emergency circumstances is permissible to work on the Sabbath based upon captivity constraints. Okay? Okay, so now in this understanding, we're going to go to 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 1 to get the history of David talking to one of the priests in past times. This is what the history that Christ was explaining to those Pharisees about David going into that tabernacle and getting that showbread. And this understanding in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 1, this is getting to the understanding where David having a conversation with that priest in order for him to what? Get the showbread to eat. Okay, this is the understanding in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verse 1. It says, then came David to Nob, to Ahimelech, the priest. And Ahimelech was afraid at the meeting of David, and said unto him, why art thou alone, and no man with thee? Because at this time, Ahimelech didn't see no man coming with David at that time, because David came to the tabernacle by himself, okay, at this time. Okay, it says, why art thou alone and no man with thee? So now David's going to have a conversation with Ahimelech. Okay. 1 Samuel 21, verse 3. Now therefore, what is under thy hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or what there is present. So I had to read, of course, a few verses down to verse 3 to give you the understanding that David's initial plan was just to get regular bread. That's why he said, give me 5 loaves of bread. So notice he didn't say, give me the showbread. He just asked for some bread because he was hungry. Okay, because he was on the run from King Saul. So he says, now therefore, what is under thy hand? Because David saw this particular priest named Ahimelech having a certain type of bread in his hand. So he's like, hey, let me get some of this bread that you have in your hand. Okay, or whatever other type of bread you have here at this tabernacle. Okay, but he's not sure if this was the showbread or not. Okay, but he's just saying, give me the 5 loaves of bread. It says, now therefore, what is under thy hand? Give me 5 loaves of bread in my hand, or what there is present. So David only wanted just bread to eat. Okay, his initial plan was not to eat the showbread. Okay, let's go to the next understanding. Okay, 1 Samuel 21, verse 6. It says, so the priest, so this particular priest named Ahimelech, gave him hollow bread. Now I was going to explain what type of bread that Ahimelech gave to David. Okay, so the priest gave him hollow bread, for there was no bread there but the showbread. So the only bread that this particular priest named Ahimelech had for David to eat was the showbread. And we know the showbread is only for the Levitical priesthood to eat. Okay, it says, for there was no bread there but the showbread that was taken from before Yahweh, to put hot bread in the day when it was taken away. So again, the only bread available for David to eat was the showbread. And this is what that priest ended up giving David to eat. Okay, so Ahimelech gave David the showbread to eat. Okay, because that's the only bread he had available for David to eat. Okay. And also to explain that David was fleeing persecution from King Saul, we're going to go a chapter back, okay, to prove that David only ate that bread from that tabernacle based on emergency circumstances, okay, because he was fleeing persecution from King Saul. So in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 31, this is the chapter before we got to the understanding when David ate that showbread from that tabernacle. Okay, it's explaining certain timelines of understanding. So we're just going to get through this real quick. Okay, 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 31. It says, for as long as the son of Jesse liveth upon the ground, thou shalt not be established, nor thy kingdom. Wherefore now send and fetch him unto me, for he shall surely die. So this is, of course, King Saul talking to, of course, one of his sons. And he's explaining that the son of Jesse, right, is going into David, because David's father was Jesse. So King Saul knew that David was going to basically replace him in the future as far as being king. Okay, so King Saul's whole objective was to kill David to prevent him from being king of Israel. Okay, so this is the understanding on why David needed something, of course, to eat in that tabernacle understanding, because he was fleeing from King Saul's persecution. Because notice, King Saul was trying to kill David at this time. Okay. And this is 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 32. And Jonathan answered Saul, his father, and said unto him, wherefore shall he be slain? What hath he done? So again, Jonathan is King Saul's son. Okay, so this is the person that was having a conversation in general with. So Jonathan was the person that was having a conversation with King Saul. So King Saul is having a conversation with Jonathan. Okay, so Jonathan is the person that was having a conversation in the book of 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 31. Okay. So again, King Saul wanted to kill David for no apparent reason. So that's what Jonathan was basically explaining. Like, why are you trying to kill David? It's not making any sense, right? So this is what Jonathan is explaining to his father Saul. Okay, so I'm just explaining that the only reason why David went to that tabernacle was for emergency purposes, to get some type of food, because he was hungry based upon fleeing persecution from King Saul, because King Saul was trying to kill David. Okay, that's the understanding. So now we go back to the book of Matthew chapter 12, verse 4, to get the understanding what Christ was explaining to those Pharisees. We go back to the understanding. It says Matthew chapter 12, verse 4. It says how he entered into the house of Elohim. So David entered into the house of Elohim. That's going into David entered that tabernacle and did eat the showbread, right? Because again, that priest named Ahimelech gave David the showbread because there was no other type of bread in the tabernacle. Okay. And it says, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat, because the showbread was only for the priesthood. Okay, the showbread was only for that Levitical priesthood to eat. Neither for them which were with him, because again, David had other men with him. Okay, and they ate as well. Okay, David didn't just show up to that tabernacle by himself without people being involved with helping him flee persecution. But David initially showed up at the tabernacle by himself, but he had a host of men in another area, okay, outside that tabernacle, okay, because again, David knew that he wasn't necessarily permissible to be at that tabernacle, okay. You had to be an Levite to be inside that tabernacle, okay. So that's why David didn't come with a whole bunch of men to go up in the tabernacle, okay, because David knew the laws of the Most High, okay, and did eat the showbread, which was not lawful for him to eat. So David ate the showbread based upon emergency circumstances, which Yahweh permitted him to do so. Because usually, if anybody just walk up on the tabernacle, they supposed to get put to death. The Most High will bring judgment right then and there. But the Most High understood the circumstances of David being on the run from persecution from King Saul, because the Most High Yah is a merciful Elohim. See, the Pharisees don't know the Most High. They don't understand the ways of the Most High. But Yahshua the Mashiach understand the ways of the Most High. So the Most High is speaking through the Spirit of Christ, the understanding that, hey, Yahweh is merciful unto those individuals in emergency cases. Okay, this is just common sense. It says, neither for them which were with him, but only for the priests, because only the priests, by the laws of Moses, can only eat that showbread that's in that tabernacle. But Yahweh allowed David to do so based upon emergency circumstances. Okay, so it's just like the understanding of modern day times with the Hebrew Israelites have to work on the Sabbath because they are in persecution. They are in captivity constraints. So Yahweh knows that, right? So this is where that mercy and grace comes in at. Okay, this is the understanding that the modern day Hebrew Israelites don't have. Okay, they act like they're not in slavery out here. Okay, this is why we got to let this Bible be true and every man a liar. This is what Christ is explaining to those Pharisees. He's explaining history. He's explaining of the mercy and grace scenario even back when David was around. Okay, so the Pharisees are not even on Christ's level of understanding. See, Yahshua Mashiach was in the right spirit of the Most High Yah. Okay, so when you walk in the spirit of the Most High Yah, these other Hebrew Israelites can't comprehend this understanding. This is above their understanding because they're carnal. Okay, they're not spiritual. Okay, the Most High is merciful. Okay, he knows certain reasons in certain cases why certain people do certain things. He knows when people are doing things intentionally or not. Okay, so the Most High is a righteous judge, as you can see right here, to allow David to even eat the showbread that's in that tabernacle, because Yahweh knew the circumstances of David when he was fleeing persecution from King Saul. So Yahweh knows the persecution of the Hebrew Israelites in modern day times. They have to work to survive on the Sabbath day. Okay, because why? The Hebrew Israelites are in captivity, just like those disciples was in a captivity constraint under the Roman Empire. But also they was following Christ, the Black Messiah, in different journeys, and they most likely have forgotten to properly prepare or prep a meal for the Sabbath day, which they basically got a hunger and started plucking ears of the corn in that field based upon an emergency circumstances. Okay, but those Pharisees not understanding why they was in that field plucking the ears of that corn, because they don't understand the circumstances that those disciples was in. They're just going on the outward appearance, judging based upon what they was seeing. And that's why those Pharisees were not righteous judges. Okay, Yahshua the Mashiach is a righteous judge. Yahweh is a righteous judge. Okay, this is what the Pharisees couldn't comprehend. And it's the same analogy with these modern day Hebrew Israelites. These men are not righteous judges. Okay, so this is why we have to follow men of this Bible, rightly dividing this word of truth, so we can get the right understanding. Okay? That's why I say let this Bible be true, every man a liar. Okay? Matthew chapter 12 verse 5. Matthew chapter 12 verse 5. And of course this is Yahshua still talking to those Pharisees. It says, or have ye not read in the law, how that on the Sabbath days the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath and are blameless? You see this, Israel? What is Christ talking about? He said, or have ye not read in the law, how that on the Sabbath days, that's that 7th day of the week understanding, the Sabbath days, the priests, talking about those Levite priests in the temple, profane the Sabbath. Because those Levite priests profane the Sabbath. How? Because they are doing a form of work on the Sabbath by what? Cutting up that certain type of meat on those animals. That's a form of work. Okay? It says, how that on the Sabbath days, the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath, because they are doing a form of work on the Sabbath by cutting up those certain type of animals to be sacrificed unto the Most High. That is a form of work. And it says, and are blameless, and are blameless. So when they are doing that form of work on a Sabbath day, they are still blameless because they're doing a righteous work. They're doing a righteous work. So this is what Christ is saying. See, these men, that's those Levite priests on the Sabbath day, they be working on the Sabbath day by doing those righteous works on the Sabbath by pertaining to those sacrifices. But that's still a form of work. Okay? But they are blameless because they're doing it in the right understanding of the Most High to atone for those certain sacrifices for the sins of Israel. That's what makes them blameless. But again, those Levite priests are still doing a form of work on the Sabbath day. Okay? Because that is still work. But it's a righteous work. Okay? Numbers chapter 28 verse 9 to explain what Christ is saying, that those Levite priests were doing a form of work on those Sabbath days. Numbers chapter 28 verse 9. And on the Sabbath day, 2 lambs of the first year without spot, and 2 tenth deals of flour for a meat offering, mingled with oil, and the drink offering thereof. So you see this, Israel? You see this? So again, the offerings had to be made on the Sabbath days, which entail a form of work. By the Levitical priesthood had to do these certain sacrifices on the Sabbath. That's a form of work. This is what Christ is bringing out, the understanding that this is a form of work, but it's a righteous work on the Sabbath. Leviticus chapter 23 verse 3. It says 6 days, according to the law. Leviticus chapter 23 verse 3. It says 6 days shall work be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of rest and holy convocation. Ye shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of Yahweh in all your dwelling. So you see this, when you go to the law, it's saying there's a rest. There's not supposed to be no work should be done. But here, you go to the book of Numbers, you have the Levitical priesthood doing a form of work by doing them offerings, which entail those sacrifices. So in certain cases, working on the Sabbath is permissible in certain cases. So the Levite priest doing that form of work of those sacrifices with those animals, understanding, is a righteous work. Okay? Even though the law says 6 days work shall be done, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of rest, and holy convocation. Ye shall do no work therein. It is the Sabbath of Yahweh in all your dwellings. Okay? So this is the understanding Christ was explaining, that those Levite priests was doing a form of work on the Sabbath day, but they are blameless because they're doing a righteous work on the Sabbath day. Even though the Sabbath day is supposed to be a day of rest. Okay? So Christ was going with the right understanding. Okay? See, Christ was going with the right understanding when we go to the book of Matthew chapter 12 verse 5, that these Pharisees couldn't comprehend what he was talking about. That's why he said the priests in the temple profane the Sabbath, because the Sabbath, they say you're not supposed to do no form of work. And did we just pull that out in Leviticus chapter 23 verse 3? That is not supposed to be no work to be done. But then Numbers chapter 28 verse 9, the Sabbath day entails sacrifices, which entails a form of work to be done. So this is what Christ is explaining to those Pharisees, even though those Levite priests are doing a form of work on the Sabbath. But guess what? They're still blameless because they're doing a righteous work on the Sabbath. Point blank, period. And the Pharisees couldn't comprehend what Yahshua the Mashiach was talking about. Matthew chapter 12, verse 6. But I say unto you that in this place is one greater than the temple. So Christ is explaining to those Pharisees that he is far greater than that temple that was in Jerusalem at that time. Because Christ is the Son of the Most High. That's why he said, but I say unto you, that is in this place is one greater than that temple. Because Christ was going to be that ultimate sacrifice for the children of Israel, to atone for all manner of sin that the children of Israel committed under that old covenant understanding. So this is what Christ is bringing out to those Pharisees with that understanding. But again, those Pharisees are ignorant of what's being said by the Black Messiah, because those Pharisees lack understanding of what this Bible is saying in its proper context. Okay, so Christ said that in this place is one greater than that temple, because Christ is above that temple that was in Jerusalem at that time, because Christ is the Son of the Most High, and he was going to be that sacrifice to atone for the sins of Israel. Okay, that's what he's saying, because the temple and that tabernacle was catered towards those sacrifices of animals, okay, to reverence towards to the Most High, right, by the Levitical priesthood. But Christ was going to be the ultimate sacrifice that was going to be above the tradition of those sacrifices of that time. When we go back in the time where Christ was on the scene in Israel. Okay. Matthew chapter 12, verse 7. It says, of course, it's Christ still talking to those Pharisees. Matthew chapter 12, verse 7. But if ye had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy and not sacrifice, ye would not have condemned the guiltless. Whoa, wait a minute. You see this, Israel? What is Christ talking about? You see, when Christ was talking to these Pharisees, he knew the Pharisees didn't have an understanding what he was talking about. That's why he told these men, but if ye had known what this meaneth, I will have mercy. Because again, the Pharisees couldn't comprehend what Christ was saying. So Christ is explaining to those Pharisees, I have mercy on those disciples. I have mercy on these disciples because I understand that these disciples were hungry. They've been following me in my certain journeys, and they made a mistake on not properly preparing for the Sabbath day to eat a certain type of meal to be eaten on the Sabbath without them going to that field to pluck ears off the corn in that field on the Sabbath day, which is a form of work. So the Most High Son, Yahshua the Mashiach, is saying, I will have mercy on these individuals, those disciples, and not sacrifice. Because again, according to the law, you're supposed to get put to death if you found working on the Sabbath day. Right? You're supposed to get put to death if you found working on the Sabbath. That's according to the law. Right? In Leviticus chapter 23, verse 3, ye shall do no work therein on the Sabbath, because it's supposed to be a day of rest. Okay, it is the Sabbath of Yahweh in all your dwellings. But again, Christ is saying, I will have mercy. So Yahshua the Mashiach is telling those Pharisees he will have mercy on those disciples because he understood. Okay, he understood why they was plucking ears of corn in the field and not sacrifice, because Yahshua the Mashiach did not come to put people to death at this time based upon those transgressions of the law. Ye would not have condemned the guiltless, because if you would have had the understanding of the right type of spirit of understanding, you wouldn't have tried to condemn those disciples who follow after Christ. Okay, the Pharisees didn't have the understanding. That's why Christ is referring to those disciples being guiltless, because they were justified by plucking the ears of the corn on the Sabbath day because they got a hunger. And also, again, the Hebrew Israelites was in captivity under the Roman Empire. Okay. This is what the comprehension of the Pharisees are not grasping. Okay. And also, Christ is the Son of the Most High. because he's far greater than that tabernacle that was in Israel at that time, because he is the Son of the Most High. His body was to be that sacrifice to atone for all manner of sin under the old covenant understanding, and those Pharisees couldn't comprehend what Yahshua Mashiach was explaining. Okay. Matthew chapter 12 verse 8. For the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. You see this, Israel? You see what Christ is explaining? Christ is explaining he's the head of this Sabbath day understanding. Okay? Yahweh put Christ to be the orchestrator, to put things in place on earth for the Hebrew Israelites to serve the Most High Yah properly, because Yahshua Mashiach is the Son of the Most High. That's why Christ says, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. Even of the Sabbath day. Explaining that Yahshua Mashiach is giving that order and explaining that, hey, I will have mercy on those disciples because I'm the Lord of the Sabbath day. Y'all are supposed to be reverencing me on this day to commission the understanding unto the Most High. Because the Black Messiah is the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. That's what he's saying. The Black Messiah is the King of Kings, Lord of Lords. That's what he's trying to explain to those Pharisees. See, the Pharisees were looking at Christ as just like a regular Hebrew Israelite. You know what I'm saying? Yahshua Mashiach is explaining to those men that I'm the king. I'm the head. Because this is supposed to be his domain in Israel. He's supposed to be running things in Israel. That's what Christ is trying to explain to those Pharisees. But those Pharisees made an allegiance with the Roman Empire, and those Pharisees were putting themselves on high like they was running the show. They not understanding that Yahshua Mashiach is the Son of the Most High, and that land of Israel is supposed to be ran by him. That's why he's saying, for the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath day. Okay? So Christ is letting those Pharisees know that I'm allowing those men to pluck ears of corn on the Sabbath day because I'm the boss. Okay? Because, again, the Son of the Most High is letting these Pharisees know that he is Lord. He's the King, Lord of Lords. But the Pharisees were wicked and they didn't understand that understanding. Okay? You know, to prove the understanding of the book of Matthew chapter 12 verse 5 understanding on Wikipedia, because of course Wikipedia is ran by the so-called white man, but I'm going to show you that the so-called white man, he knows what I just broke down is the right understanding. So this is just another example of evidence to show you that this is the proper breakdown understanding of Matthew chapter 12 verse 5 understanding what Christ was trying to explain to those Pharisees of the understanding of the Levitical priesthood and also what is permissible under the laws pertaining to the Sabbath day understanding. So we zoom in, scroll down, we go to, okay, so now we go to an analyst right here. This is the breakdown understanding to show that what I broke down earlier is factual. This is the analyst right here. It says Jesus, or we say Yahshua. Yahshua appears to refer to the slaying and skinning and cutting up animals, in addition to the laying of wood and kindling a fire by which animals were burnt to honor God. Although in themselves they are considered work and would profane the Sabbath unless pity allowed it. So when we go to the book of Matthew chapter 5, this is what Christ was explaining, that those Levitical priesthood were doing a form of work on the Sabbath days by profaning the Sabbath, right? Because they was doing a form of work, but it was put aside because they was doing a form of righteous work on the Sabbath pertaining to those sacrifices that had to be done on the Sabbath day. And this is what makes the Levite priest to be blamed. Because the Most High had pity, or he showed a mercy situation to the Levitical priesthood by doing a form of work on the Sabbath day. Because why? That was things pertaining to the Sabbath day ritual. Okay? So this is what the scholars know. Okay? When it says Yahshua appears to refer to the slaying and skinning and cutting up animals, in addition to the laying of wood and kindling a fire by which animals were burnt to honor Elohim. Although in themselves they are considered work because doing those sacrifices is a form of work. So these type of sacrifices was done on the Sabbath day, and would profane the Sabbath because you're doing a form of work on the Sabbath when the Sabbath pertains to no working. But it says, and would profane the Sabbath unless pity allowed it. So Yahweh allowed the Levitical priesthood to do a form of work on the Sabbath day. Okay. And also it says, so also as necessity from hunger excuse David. You see that? Just like I established earlier with the issue with David. Yahweh allowed David to eat that showbread in that tabernacle based upon him being a hungered and based upon him fleeing persecution from King Saul, based upon an emergency circumstances. So Yahweh allowed David to do so. Okay, so it shows you that Yahweh has mercy upon people. Okay, he's a righteous judge. It says the disciples are excused from a breach of the Sabbath because they follow the Messiah and are so intent upon Yahshua teaching that they have forgotten to prepare food. You see this, Israel? Now you see why Yahshua allowed those disciples to pluck the ear of the corn in the field on the Sabbath day, because he knew that they had forgotten to prepare food for the Sabbath day because they was on those missionary journeys with Christ the Black Messiah. That's what this so-called white scholar is putting out there, because he understands what the book of Matthew chapter 12 verse 5 is getting into. It says, the disciples are excused from a breach of the Sabbath because they followed the Messiah, because they followed Christ the Black Messiah. Okay, they just made a mistake on not properly preparing for the Sabbath to eat a certain type of meal or food. Okay, so again, it shows you that Yahshua is merciful, and also it shows you Yahweh is merciful to his people. Okay, in certain instances, in certain cases. Okay, so this is what those Pharisees couldn't comprehend, that Yahweh is merciful to his people in certain cases, especially when it pertains to emergency circumstances. Okay, Proverbs chapter 17 verse 15. It says, he that justifieth the wicked and he that condemneth the just, even they both are an abomination to Yahweh. You see this, Israel? So again, when you are actually justifying wicked Hebrew Israelites, you're going off, right? You're in the midst of sin. You are in the midst of an abomination. And also, and he that condemneth the just, even they both are an abomination unto Yahweh, right? Even they both are an abomination to Yahweh. So even when you have men and women condemning Hebrew Israelites that are just, meaning they are righteous, you're an abomination to the Most High, because you're condemning just individuals. So if any Hebrew Israelite is trying to judge a Hebrew Israelite based upon them working on the Sabbath, based upon emergency circumstances, meaning that they're working on the Sabbath to take care of themselves, you're going off. Okay, because Yahweh is permissible on certain things based upon emergency circumstances. That's why we broke out the history of the sacrificial law understanding on the Sabbath day. When the Levites was doing a form of work on the Sabbath day, Yahweh allowed that thing to take place because why? They're doing the sacrificial ritual pertaining to what? The Sabbath day understanding. Same analogy that Christ was merciful, and also Yahweh was merciful unto those disciples based upon them getting hungry. They was having to pluck the ears of the corn on the Sabbath day because they got hungry. Okay, they made a mistake. Okay, it's because again, like I say, I brought this out to show you that Yahweh is merciful to his people. Okay, so let's go to Matthew chapter 12 verse 2 again. But when the Pharisees saw it, they said unto him, behold, thy disciples do that which is not lawful to do upon the Sabbath day. So again, those Pharisees couldn't comprehend the understanding of Yahweh's mercy. They could not comprehend the understanding of Yahshua Mashiach's mercy unto those disciples, or unto his people, the Israelites, in certain cases on the Sabbath day. Okay, those Pharisees lacked the understanding. Just like modern day times, those Hebrew Israelites lacked the understanding of Yahweh's grace and mercy pertaining to his Sabbath day, when a certain type of form of work may have to be done. Okay. Matthew chapter 12 verse 1 again. At that time, Yahshua went on the Sabbath day through the corn, and his disciples were an hungered, and began to pluck the ears of the corn and to eat. So now we got the understanding why those disciples plucked the ears of the corn on the Sabbath day, because they did not properly prepare on the Sabbath day by mistake, because they was following Yahshua Mashiach on those missionary journeys, and they made a mistake not to properly prepare. Okay, because like I said earlier, the Hebrew Israelites are not perfect. So again, the Hebrew Israelites make mistakes. So Yahshua knew that understanding. Of course, Yahweh knew that understanding, that again, mistakes are going to be made. Okay, and Yahshua at this time was not sent to the earth at this time to kill people at this time. He was sent to show a mercy and love scenario to his people, the Hebrew Israelites, and those Pharisees didn't have understanding of that understanding. So Yahshua broke that history down pertaining to the Levites. He broke that history down based upon David, and he also broke the understanding that those disciples were righteous. They were guiltless. And he was explaining to those Pharisees that those Pharisees was going off in the midst of sin, committing an abomination, trying to condemn just men who followed him, because those disciples followed Christ. They weren't arguing back and forth with Christ like those Pharisees was trying to do to Christ. See, those Pharisees were wicked men trying to pass judgment on others. So again, just like in modern day times, you have Hebrew Israelites that's trying to pass judgment on other Hebrew Israelites that's working on the Sabbath. But when you look inside those individuals may be battling with drugs. Those individuals may be battling with pornography. Those individuals may be battling with other type of form of lust. Those individuals may be battling with not taking care of their children. See, these men of modern day Hebrew Israelites that are trying to pass judgment on other Hebrew Israelites all the time, they are hypocrites. Because if we open up their door, they're going to be falling short in all type of manners. Okay? Just like those Pharisees. Those Pharisees were hypocrites. They couldn't judge no man. Okay? So this is what Yahshua was explaining to those Pharisees. You are wicked men trying to pass judgment on just men. Okay? We got that analogy in the book of Matthew chapter 12 verse 7. That Yahshua the Mashiach called those Pharisees out and showed them that they didn't know what they was talking about. And they had no understanding what Christ was saying. But Christ said, I will have mercy. So Yahshua said, I will have mercy on those disciples. I will have mercy on those Hebrew Israelites that have to do what they have to do to survive even on the Sabbath day. And not sacrifice, because Yahshua the Mashiach is not come at this time to put those Hebrew Israelites that was doing a certain type of form of work on the Sabbath day. He was there to teach and show the Hebrew Israelites to show a certain type of form of love and mercy. This is what Christ came with, that type of spirit. Pharisees couldn't comprehend that type of spirit. They was all about letters of the law. Okay, you would not have condemned the guiltless, because those disciples were guiltless according to Christ and also according to Yahweh. So you Hebrew Israelites, you need to pay attention to what this Bible is saying. Stop listening to men. Listen to men that's rightly dividing this word of truth, man. So that's why I had to do this lesson. This is the part 2 lesson of the understanding it's lawful to do well on the Sabbath days while in captivity video. Okay, this is the part 2 lesson. And stay tuned, Israel, for part 3 lesson of the conclusion of the matter on this understanding about it's lawful to do well on the Sabbath days while in captivity. Okay, so this is going to be part 3 coming soon. So Israel, hopefully you took your notes to get the understanding on the mercy and grace scenario if you do have to work on the Sabbath day while in captivity. Understand? And so I just had to break out this little history, Israel. So hopefully you was able to comprehend the analogy of the understanding. Okay, that Christ is coming with more of a grace and mercy scenario pertaining to the Sabbath. day understanding, whereas those Pharisees was coming mostly on the persecution aspect of the Sabbath day law, because they didn't have interest of the understanding as far as the mercy and grace scenario. Okay. Other than that, Israel, hopefully you enjoyed this lesson on Kingdom Builders of Israel LC YouTube channel. Stay tuned, Israel, for the part 3 lesson on it's lawful to do well on the Sabbath days while in captivity. Okay, stay tuned for part 3 lesson of that understanding. Other than that, Israel, shalom.